This is what family life was like in biblical times. Daily routines explained in detail today. If you have ever wondered what it truly meant to wake up before dawn in the ancient world, to carry water from a well under the burning sun, to raise children in a land where every day was a battle for survival, then this story will take you back thousands of years to a time when family was everything, when love was sealed with a covenant, and when the rhythm of life was dictated not by clocks, but by the movement of the moon across the vast, silent sky. This is what family life was really like in biblical times, and the details will leave you speechless. In a small settlement nestled among the hills of ancient Judea, where the earth was the color of burnt copper and the olive trees twisted like the hands of old men reaching toward heaven, there lived a man named Ezra, son of Levi. Ezra was not a king, not a priest, not a warrior whose name would be remembered in scrolls. He was something far more common and far more important. He was a father. He was a husband. He was the kind of man who held an entire household together with nothing but the strength of his calloused hands and the quiet determination in his dark eyes. Ezra had married a woman named Miriam when she was barely 17 years old, and he himself had been 20. Their union had been arranged by their fathers, as was the custom in those days, but what began as obligation had slowly blossomed into something deeper, something neither of them had the vocabulary to name, but both of them felt every evening when the oil lamps were lit and the children gathered close. Miriam was a woman of remarkable endurance. She had borne 5 children, 3 of whom survived past their first year. She knew the taste of grief, the weight of loss, and the stubborn refusal to let sorrow define her. Every morning, before the first pale light appeared on the eastern horizon, Miriam was already awake, already moving, already preparing for a day that would demand everything she had. The house they lived in was made of mud, brick, and stone, with a flat roof where the family sometimes slept during the hottest months. It was small by any standard, a single main room with a raised platform at one end where the family slept on mats of woven reeds. The lower portion of the room, just a few steps down, was where the animals were kept at night. A few goats and a small donkey whose warmth helped heat the home during the cold desert nights. The smell was something a modern person would find unbearable. But for Ezra and Miriam, it was simply the smell of home, the mingled scent of animal hair, dried herbs, bread baking on hot stones, and the faint sweetness of olive oil. Their eldest surviving child was a boy named Caleb, who was 12 years old and already learning his father's trade. Ezra was a carpenter, though the word does not quite capture what that meant in biblical times. He did not merely build furniture. He built plows, yokes for oxen, doors, roof beams, and sometimes even the wooden frameworks for the stone houses that dotted the hillside. His workshop was a small area beside the house, open to the sky, where tools hung from pegs driven into the wall. Tools that had been passed down from his own father and his father before him. A bronze adze, a bow drill, a small saw with teeth that had been sharpened so many times the blade was thin as a finger. These were Ezra's inheritance, and they were worth more to him than gold. Caleb was a serious boy, quiet and watchful, who had inherited his mother's dark, expressive eyes and his father's broad shoulders. He was at the age where he was no longer a child, but not yet a man, and the tension of that transition showed in everything he did. He worked alongside his father without complaint, but sometimes Ezra caught him staring out toward the distant hills with a look that suggested his thoughts were somewhere far away, in places his father's tools could not reach. The second child was a girl named Hannah, who was 9 years old and had already begun learning the countless skills that would define her life as a woman. Miriam was her teacher in all things, and Hannah followed her mother like a shadow, absorbing knowledge not through formal instruction, but through constant observation and imitation. She could already grind grain, tend the fire, and weave simple patterns on the small loom that sat in the corner of their home. She was also the one who sang, her voice rising in the early morning like a bird's, filling the small house with melodies that seemed to push back the darkness. The youngest was a boy named Asher, only 4 years old with a round face and an endless supply of energy that exhausted everyone around him. Asher was the joy of the household, the one who made Miriam laugh even on her hardest days, the one who climbed into Ezra's lap at the end of the evening and fell asleep with his small fist clutching his father's tunic. In a world where so many children did not survive, Asher's laughter was a sound that both parents treasured with a fierce, almost desperate gratitude. The daily routine of this family began in darkness. Miriam was always the first to rise, usually an hour or more before dawn. She would carefully untangle herself from the sleeping mat, stepping over the children with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this thousands of times. Her first task was the fire. The hearth was a simple arrangement of stones in the center of the room, and Miriam would coax the embers from the previous night back to life, feeding them with dried dung and small sticks until a steady flame appeared. Fire was essential. Without it, there was no bread, no warmth, no light. Tending the fire was not a chore. It was an act of survival, and Miriam approached it with the seriousness it deserved. Once the fire was burning, she would begin preparing the day's bread. This was perhaps the most important task of her morning, because bread was not merely food, it was life itself. The family's supply of grain, usually wheat or barley, was stored in large clay jars near the back of the house. Miriam would measure out the amount she needed, pour it onto the grinding stone, and begin the slow, rhythmic work of milling the grain into flour. The grinding stone was a heavy, flat piece of basalt, and the upper stone, the rider, was shaped to fit her hands. She would push it back and forth, the sound of stone on stone filling the quiet house like a heartbeat. This work was hard on the body. It strained the back, the shoulders, the wrists. Over the years, Miriam's hands had become strong and rough, her knuckles swollen, her palms permanently calloused. But she never complained. This was simply what women did. This was how families survived. Once the flour was ground, she mixed it with water and a small amount of salt, kneading it into a dough that she would let rest briefly before shaping it into flat rounds. She baked the bread on a convex clay dome placed over the fire, a device called a tanner, and within minutes, the smell of fresh bread would fill the house, drawing the children from their sleep like an invisible hand. Bread baked this way was thin and slightly charred on the outside, soft and warm on the inside, and it was eaten at every meal, used to scoop up whatever food was available, from lentil stew to olive oil to a paste made from crushed sesame seeds. By the time the bread was ready, Ezra was awake and preparing for his own day. He would step outside into the cool pre-dawn air, wash his face and hands with water from a clay basin, and offer a quiet prayer. Prayer was woven into the fabric of daily life in biblical times. It was not a separate activity, something done at a specific time in a specific place. It was a constant conversation, a running dialogue with the divine that accompanied every action, every decision, every breath. Ezra would pray for his family's safety, for the day's work to go well, for rain to come when the earth was dry. His prayers were simple and earnest, the words of a man who believed with his whole heart that he was being heard. After prayer, Ezra would eat his morning meal, a piece of bread, a handful of olives, perhaps a few dried figs. The morning meal was never large. Food was too precious to be consumed carelessly. Every bite represented hours of labor, from the planting of the seed, to the harvesting of the crop, to the grinding of the grain. Waste was not merely frowned upon, it was considered a kind of moral failure, an insult to the hard work that had produced the food and to the divine providence that had made the harvest possible. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal. Every week, we bring you untold stories from the ancient world that you will not find anywhere else. Stories that reveal the raw, emotional truth of how our ancestors lived, loved, and survived. If you are not subscribed yet, you are missing out on journeys through time that will change the way you see the world. Subscribe now and join a community of people who are hungry for real stories. With the morning meal finished, the family would scatter to their respective tasks, and this is where the true picture of biblical family life begins to emerge in all its complexity. Ezra would walk to his workshop, or, if he had been commissioned to do work in another village, he would load his tools onto the donkey and set out on the road. The roads of ancient Judea were not paved highways. They were narrow, dusty paths that wound through rocky terrain, and traveling even a few miles could take hours. Ezra often traveled with other men from the village, partly for companionship and partly for safety, because the roads were not always safe. Bandits were a real and present danger, men who lived in the wilderness and preyed on travelers, and a lone man with valuable tools was an inviting target. When Ezra worked in his own village, Caleb was always at his side. The boy was learning quickly, and Ezra felt a deep pride watching his son's hands become more skilled with each passing week. There was a particular way that Caleb held the adze now, with a confidence that had not been there 6 months ago, and Ezra recognized in that grip the echo of his own father's teaching. This was how knowledge was transmitted in the ancient world, not through books or schools, but through the intimate, patient transfer of skill from one generation to the next, father to son, mother to daughter, an unbroken chain that stretched back to the very beginning of human civilization. While Ezra and Caleb worked with wood and stone, Miriam's day was a relentless cycle of labor that would continue until well after dark. After the morning bread was made and the family fed, she would take the large clay water jug, balance it on her head or her hip, and walk to the village well. The well was the social center of the village, the place where women gathered not only to draw water, but to exchange news, share concerns, and maintain the bonds of community that were essential to survival. Miriam would greet the other women, ask about their families, listen to the latest developments, and contribute her own observations. These gatherings were far more than idle gossip. They were the network through which vital information flowed, information about which families were struggling, which children were unwell, which men had found work, and which crops were failing. In a world without written newspapers or official announcements, the women at the well were the living, breathing information system of the entire community. Drawing water was hard physical work. The well was deep, and the rope was rough against the hands. Miriam would lower the bucket, wait for the splash, and then haul it back up, hand over hand, the weight of the water pulling against her arms and shoulders. She would fill her jug, lift it, and carry it back to the house, a journey that might take 20 minutes each way. She often made this trip 2 or 3 times a day because water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, and tending the small garden that grew beside the house. That garden was Miriam's domain, a small patch of earth where she grew herbs, onions, garlic, cucumbers, and a few other vegetables that supplemented the family's diet. Tending the garden required constant attention, especially in the dry months, when every drop of water had to be carefully rationed. Miriam had learned from her own mother how to read the soil, how to know when a plant was thirsty, when it was getting too much sun, when the insects were threatening the leaves. She taught these skills to Hannah, who knelt beside her in the dirt, small hands mimicking her mother's movements, learning through doing just as Miriam herself had learned. The midday meal was the largest of the day, eaten when the sun was at its highest, and the heat made outdoor work nearly impossible. The family would gather in the shade of the house, or if the heat was particularly fierce, they would retreat to the lower level of the home, where the thick stone walls kept the air marginally cooler. The meal typically consisted of bread, lentil stew, olives, and whatever vegetables were available from the garden. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions, festivals, and the visits of honored guests. When an animal was slaughtered, it was an event that involved the entire household and sometimes the entire neighborhood, because in a world without refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting and drying. The lentil stew that Miriam prepared was a staple of the ancient diet, a thick, hearty mixture of red or brown lentils cooked with onions, garlic, cumin, and a generous amount of olive oil. It was nutritious, filling, and could be made in large quantities, which was important in a household where food needed to stretch as far as possible. Miriam cooked in a single large pot, a round-bottomed clay vessel that sat directly on the fire, and she stirred the stew with a wooden spoon that Ezra had carved for her years ago, one of the first things he had ever made with his own hands. After the midday meal, there was a brief period of rest, though rest is perhaps too generous a word. Miriam would use this time to work on weaving or mending clothes, tasks that could be done while sitting in the shade. The family's clothing was simple, a tunic made of wool or linen that reached to the knees for men and to the ankles for women, belted at the waist with a cloth sash. Over this, a heavier outer garment, a cloak, was worn during cooler weather, and at night, this cloak doubled as a blanket. Miriam wove the fabric for these garments herself, using a vertical loom that stood against the wall of the house. The loom was made of 2 upright beams with a crossbar at the top, and the warp threads hung down, weighted with small stones. Miriam would pass the shuttle back and forth, building the fabric row by row, a process that was meditative in its rhythm, but demanding in its precision. Weaving was more than a practical skill. It was an art form, and the quality of a woman's weaving was a source of pride and social standing. A well-made garment could last for years, and the patterns and colors a woman chose reflected her taste, her skill, and her family's status. Miriam was known in the village for the evenness of her weave and the rich colors she achieved using natural dyes, reds from pomegranate skins, yellows from turmeric, blues from the indigo plant that a traveling merchant had once sold her at a price that had made Ezra shake his head in disbelief. As the afternoon wore on and the heat began to relent, the village came back to life. Men returned from the fields or their workshops, women resumed their outdoor tasks, and children spilled out of the houses like water from a broken jar, their voices filling the narrow lanes between the buildings. This was the time of day when the community was most visible, most alive, and it was during these hours that much of the social business of the village was conducted. Ezra would often sit with the other men near the village gate, a wide opening in the low stone wall that surrounded the settlement. The gate was the traditional gathering place for the men of the village, the place where disputes were settled, contracts were made, and decisions affecting the entire community were discussed. This was not a formal court of law, but it served much the same purpose. If two neighbors disagreed about the boundary of their land, they would bring their case to the elders who sat at the gate. If a marriage was being arranged, the families would meet at the gate to negotiate the terms. If a stranger arrived in the village, he would be received at the gate and offered hospitality, because in the ancient world the treatment of strangers was not merely a social nicety, but a sacred obligation. Ezra was not yet old enough to be considered an elder, but he was respected for his skill as a carpenter and for his even temper. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who weighed his words carefully before offering them, and who could see both sides of an argument without losing sight of what was right. The other men valued his judgment, and it was not uncommon for them to ask his opinion on matters that had nothing to do with wood or tools. While Ezra engaged in the social life of the village, Miriam was preparing the evening meal, the last of the day's 3 meals and often the simplest. It might consist of bread with olive oil, a few pieces of dried fruit, and perhaps some cheese made from goat's milk. As she worked, she would tell stories to the children, stories that had been passed down through countless generations, stories of their ancestors, of the great leaders and prophets who had shaped their people's history. These stories were not entertainment, though they were certainly entertaining. They were education, identity, and moral instruction all wrapped into one. Through these stories, the children learned who they were, where they came from, and what was expected of them. Hannah listened with wide, attentive eyes, absorbing every word with the seriousness of a child who understood, even at 9 years old, that these stories mattered. Caleb, at 12, was beginning to hear the stories differently, questioning details, asking why certain decisions were made, challenging the assumptions that had once seemed so obvious. This was a sign of his growing maturity, and Miriam handled his questions with patience and care, never dismissing his doubts but gently guiding him toward a deeper understanding. Little Asher, meanwhile, would sit in her lap and play with a small wooden toy that Ezra had carved for him, a little donkey with legs that moved, and he would make sounds for the donkey while the stories flowed over him like music, half understood but deeply felt. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, the family would gather on the roof. This was their time, the precious hour between the end of the day's work and the onset of sleep, when the entire family was together, and the world seemed to slow down just enough to breathe. Ezra would sit with his back against the low parapet, Miriam beside him, the children arrayed around them in their customary positions. The air would cool, the stars would begin to appear, and the moon, that eternal companion of the night, would rise above the eastern hills, casting its silver light over the village like a benediction. The moon held deep significance in their lives. It was more than a source of light in the darkness. It was the calendar by which they measured their months, the signal that told them when to plant and when to harvest, when to celebrate and when to mourn. The new moon marked the beginning of each month, and its appearance was greeted with special prayers and, in some months, with festivals that brought the entire community together. Miriam had a particular fondness for the full moon, that night when the sky was bright enough to see the details of the landscape, when the olive trees cast shadows and the well glittered like a silver coin. She told Hannah that the moon was a reminder that even in darkness, there was always light, and that the darkest nights were always followed by renewal. These rooftop evenings were also the time when Ezra taught his sons, not the practical skills of carpentry, which were learned in the workshop, but the deeper lessons of life, the principles and values that would guide them when they became men. He taught them about justice, about treating others with fairness and respect. He taught them about mercy, about the importance of forgiveness and compassion, especially toward those who had less. He taught them about honor, about keeping one's word and standing by one's commitments even when it was difficult. And he taught them about love, about the bond between husband and wife, between parent and child, between neighbors, between a person and the community that sustained them. These were not abstract lessons. Ezra illustrated them with stories from their own lives, with examples drawn from the daily events of the village. When Caleb asked why their neighbor, a man named Joab who was known for his difficult temperament, had been given a share of the harvest even though he had contributed less than the other men, Ezra explained that Joab's wife was unwell and that he had been spending his days caring for her instead of working in the fields. The harvest was shared not according to what each person deserved, but according to what each person needed, because in a community this small, the suffering of one was the suffering of all. Night fell quickly in the ancient world, and when it came, it was absolute. There were no streetlights, no glowing windows, no distant hum of electricity. There was only darkness, deep and complete, broken only by the stars, the moon, and the faint glow of oil lamps inside the houses. Miriam would light the family's lamp, a simple clay vessel filled with olive oil with a wick of twisted flax, and its small flame would cast dancing shadows on the walls as the family settled in for the night. Sleep came on mats laid out on the raised platform at the back of the room, the entire family close together, sharing warmth and comfort. Asher always positioned himself between his parents, his small body a warm presence that both Ezra and Miriam found deeply reassuring. Hannah slept beside her mother, and Caleb, who was beginning to assert his independence, slept at the edge of the platform, as close to the outside as he could get without actually being off the mat. Miriam would lie awake for a few minutes after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of her family breathing, the rustling of the animals below, the distant cry of a jackal in the hills. In those quiet moments, she would offer her own prayer, a wordless expression of gratitude for another day survived, another day of having everyone she loved within arm's reach. But life in biblical times was not simply a matter of routine. Beneath the surface of daily survival, there were currents of tension, change, and conflict that could disrupt even the most stable household. And it was one such disruption that would soon test Ezra and Miriam's family in ways they had never imagined. It began with a conversation at the village gate. A merchant had arrived from the coast, a man who traveled between the great port cities and the inland settlements, carrying goods and, more importantly, news. The merchant told the men at the gate that the regional governor had imposed a new requirement, a census that would require every head of household to travel to his ancestral city and register his family. The purpose of the census was to assess the population for the purpose of collecting contributions to the governor's treasury, and failure to comply would result in severe penalties. For Ezra, this news was deeply troubling. His ancestral city was Bethlehem, a journey of several days on foot, and the thought of leaving his workshop, his home, and his community for that long filled him with anxiety. The rainy season was approaching, and there was work to be done, a new roof beam for the synagogue, a plow that needed repair before the planting season, a door he had promised to make for a young couple who were building their first home. Every day away from his workshop was a day of lost income, and in a world where there was no margin for error, even a small loss could have serious consequences. But more than the practical concerns, Ezra was troubled by the thought of taking his family on the road. Travel was dangerous, especially for women and children. The roads were rough, the distances long, and the inns along the way were often dirty, overcrowded, and frequented by people of questionable character. Miriam was strong, but she was not a young woman anymore, and the thought of her walking for days in the heat, carrying supplies, managing the children, filled Ezra with a protective anger that he struggled to contain. He discussed the matter with Miriam that evening on the roof, speaking in the low, serious tone he used when something truly important was at stake. Miriam listened without interrupting, her face calm and attentive in the moonlight. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised him. She said she wanted to go. She said that the journey would be good for the children, that they needed to see the wider world, to understand that their small village was part of something larger. She said that Caleb, in particular, was at an age where such an experience could shape him, could give him a sense of perspective and identity that he would carry for the rest of his life. And she said, with a quiet firmness that Ezra knew better than to argue with, that she was not afraid. Ezra looked at his wife in the moonlight, at her strong, weathered face, at the lines around her eyes that spoke of years of hard work and quiet courage, and he felt a wave of admiration so intense it almost hurt. He had married this woman because their fathers had arranged it, but he stayed married to her because she was the bravest person he had ever known. He nodded, and the decision was made. The preparations for the journey took several days and revealed, in vivid detail, the complexity of travel in the ancient world. Food had to be prepared and packed, enough to sustain a family of 5 for at least a week. Miriam baked extra bread, drying it in the sun so it would keep longer. She packed dried figs, olives, a skin of olive oil, a block of hard cheese, and several handfuls of roasted grain. A portable, high-energy food that travelers had relied on for centuries. Water was carried in goatskin bags, and Ezra made sure they had enough to last between the known water sources along the route. Clothing had to be considered as well. The nights could be cold, especially in the hill country, and rain was a possibility. Each family member would wear their heavier cloak, and Miriam packed an extra blanket for the children. Sandals were inspected and repaired, because on a journey of this length, a broken sandal strap could be more than an inconvenience. It could be a genuine crisis. Ezra loaded the donkey with the heaviest supplies, the water bags, the food, the tools he could not leave behind, and arranged them so that little Asher could ride when he grew tired. The donkey, a patient, long-suffering animal named Boaz, accepted his burden with the stoic resignation that donkeys have perfected over millennia. Hannah named him after a great ancestor, and the name had stuck, even though the donkey seemed entirely unaware of the honor. The morning of their departure was clear and cool, the sky a deep, crystalline blue that seemed to go on forever. Miriam woke even earlier than usual, lit the fire, baked one last batch of fresh bread, and fed the family a hearty meal. Caleb was unusually quiet, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Hannah was practically vibrating with anticipation, her eyes bright and her voice pitched higher than normal. Asher, oblivious to the significance of the occasion, was more interested in a beetle he had found near the hearth. They set out just as the sun was breaking over the eastern hills, its light flooding the valley in warm gold. Miriam took one last look at their house, at the garden she had tended so carefully, at the loom standing in its corner, at the grinding stone that had been her constant companion for 20 years. She felt a pang of something that was not quite sadness, more like the sharp awareness that comes from knowing you are leaving a place that holds so much of who you are. Then she turned, adjusted her head covering, and began to walk. The first day of travel was the hardest, as first days usually are. The body had not yet adjusted to the constant motion. The feet protested against the rocky path, and the sun, which had seemed so pleasant at dawn, became a relentless adversary by midday. Ezra set a steady pace, not too fast for the children, but fast enough to cover a reasonable distance before dark. Caleb walked beside his father, trying to match his stride, while Hannah stayed close to Miriam, her earlier excitement fading into a determined silence. Asher rode on the donkey, his small legs dangling on either side, his head turning constantly to take in the unfamiliar landscape. They traveled with a group of other families from the village, all heading in the same general direction, and the company was a comfort. There is safety in numbers, and there is also the simple human pleasure of shared experience. The women walked together, talking in low voices, while the men scouted ahead and kept watch on the surrounding hills. Children ran between the groups, forming temporary alliances and dissolving them just as quickly, their laughter echoing across the dry landscape. The road they followed was ancient, a path worn into the earth by countless feet over countless centuries. It wound through valleys and over ridges, past terraced hillsides where olive trees grew in orderly rows, past vineyards where the last of the season's grapes still hung on the vine, past shepherds who watched their flocks from rocky outcrops and raised a hand in greeting as the travelers passed. The landscape was beautiful in its austerity, all earth tones and sharp angles, with the sky arching above like a great blue dome. By late afternoon, Ezra began looking for a suitable place to camp. They found it in a small clearing near a spring, a patch of level ground surrounded by low trees that would provide some shelter from the wind. The families spread out, each claiming a space, and the women began preparing the evening meal while the men gathered firewood and checked the area for any signs of danger. Miriam unpacked the food, tore the dried bread into pieces, and soaked them in water to soften them. She heated the lentil paste over a small fire and distributed it on the bread, a simple meal that tasted remarkably good after a long day of walking. After the meal, the travelers gathered around the fires, and the atmosphere shifted from the focused intensity of travel to the relaxed warmth of community. Stories were told, songs were sung, and the children, who had been surprisingly well behaved during the day's march, finally released their pent-up energy in a burst of running, climbing, and general chaos that their parents were too tired to restrain. Ezra sat near the fire with Miriam, watching the flames and listening to the sounds around him, the crackle of burning wood, the murmur of conversation, the distant bleating of a goat, the vast silence of the night pressing in from all sides. It was on this first night, camped under the stars, that something happened which would change the course of Caleb's life. A young girl from another family in the group, a girl named Ruth who was about Caleb's age, approached the fire where the family was sitting and asked, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, if Caleb would like to see the constellation she had found. Caleb looked at his father, who gave a barely perceptible nod, and then followed Ruth to a spot where the firelight did not reach, and the stars were visible in all their overwhelming abundance. Ruth was the daughter of a merchant named Simon, a man who traded in spices and fine cloth and who was considerably wealthier than Ezra. She was tall for her age, with a quick smile and an intelligence that sparkled in her eyes like the stars she was pointing out. She knew the names of the constellations, had learned them from her father, who had traveled far and wide and had picked up knowledge the way other men picked up coins. She showed Caleb the Great Bear, the Hunter, and the Seven Sisters, and she told him stories about each one, stories that were different from any he had heard before, stories that came from distant lands with names he could barely pronounce. Caleb was entranced, not just by the stars, though they were magnificent, but by this girl who seemed to know so much about a world he had barely imagined. He found himself talking to her with an ease he had never felt with anyone outside his family, telling her about his father's workshop, about the grain of different woods, about the satisfaction of making something useful with his hands. Ruth listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood the value of what he was describing, and Caleb felt something shift inside him, a subtle rearrangement of his interior landscape that he would not fully understand for years. Miriam, watching from a distance, saw the interaction and felt a complex mix of emotions. She was happy for her son, glad that he was experiencing something new and clearly positive. But she was also aware, with the sharp intuition of a mother, that this moment was a kind of departure, a first step on a road that would eventually lead Caleb away from her and into his own life. She did not know whether Ruth would remain in their lives or fade from memory like so many childhood encounters, but she knew that Caleb would never be quite the same after tonight, and that knowledge was both beautiful and painful. The journey continued for 3 more days, each one bringing new experiences and challenges. The terrain grew more rugged as they moved south, the hills steeper and the valleys deeper. On the second day, they passed through a town where the market was in full swing, and Miriam allowed Hannah to choose a small gift, a ribbon for her hair, bright blue like the sky, which the girl clutched with a delight that was disproportionate to the ribbon's value but perfectly proportional to its significance. On the third day, Asher developed a fever, and Miriam spent a sleepless night tending him, bathing his forehead with cool water and holding him against her chest, singing softly and praying fervently. By morning, the fever had broken, and Asher was his usual energetic self, apparently unaware of the terror he had caused his mother. Caleb and Ruth continued to spend time together, their conversations growing longer and deeper with each passing day. Ezra noticed, and he noticed too the way Simon, Ruth's father, watched the pair with an expression that suggested he was doing calculations in his head, weighing the pros and cons of a potential match. In the ancient world, such calculations were expected, even necessary. Marriage was not just a union of two hearts. It was a merging of two families, two sets of resources, two networks of relationships. Simon was a practical man, and Ezra was a good carpenter in a world that needed good carpenters. The numbers might work. But Ezra was not sure how he felt about the possibility. Simon was a wealthier man, which could mean opportunity for Caleb, but could also mean expectations that Ezra's family might struggle to meet. The bride price, the gifts, the wedding feast, all of these were obligations that the groom's family was expected to fulfill, and they were obligations that could be cripplingly expensive for a family of modest means. Ezra pushed these thoughts aside, telling himself it was too early, that the children were too young, that the future was a road best traveled one step at a time. But the thoughts kept coming back, like stones in a field that reappeared no matter how many times they were removed. If this story is making you think about your own family, about the people you love and the routines that hold your life together, then type in the comments right now. Family is everything. Do it now, because I want to see how many of you feel the way Ezra and Miriam felt, that deep, fierce love for the people who share your life. They arrived in Bethlehem on the 4th day, late in the afternoon, when the sun was low and the ancient city was bathed in a warm, golden light that made its stone buildings glow as if lit from within. Bethlehem was larger than their village, a proper town with a marketplace, an inn, and a synagogue that dominated the center of the settlement. The streets were narrow and crowded, filled with people who had come from all over the region in response to the census, and the noise and activity were overwhelming after the quiet of the road. Finding a place to stay was the first challenge. The inn was full, as were most of the private homes that took in guests. Ezra and Miriam walked through the town, Asher riding on Boaz the donkey, Caleb and Hannah trailing behind with tired, uncertain faces. Finally, an elderly woman who remembered Ezra's father took pity on them and offered them a space in the lower room of her house, the area normally reserved for animals. It was not ideal, but it was dry, relatively clean, and more importantly, it was a roof over their heads. Miriam thanked the woman profusely and set about making the space as comfortable as possible, laying out their mats, arranging their supplies, and creating, through sheer force of will, a temporary home in an unfamiliar place. The census itself was a tedious process that required Ezra to present himself before the local official, state his name, his lineage, and the number of people in his household. He waited in line for hours, surrounded by other men who were equally impatient and equally resentful of the entire exercise. When his turn finally came, the official, a bored-looking man with ink-stained fingers and a permanent frown, recorded Ezra's information on a scroll, waved him away, and called for the next person. The entire interaction took less than 5 minutes, and as Ezra walked away, he could not help but feel that the journey, the expense, and the disruption to his life had been a disproportionate price to pay for such a trivial bureaucratic exercise. But the journey was not wasted. In Bethlehem, Ezra reconnected with relatives he had not seen in years, cousins and uncles who welcomed him with the enthusiastic warmth that characterized family reunions in the ancient world. There were meals shared in crowded rooms, stories exchanged over cups of wine, and the slow, pleasurable process of catching up on years of separated lives. Miriam, too, found connections, women who remembered her from previous visits, who admired her weaving and asked about her children. Hannah was fascinated by the larger town, its unfamiliar sights and sounds, and she stayed close to her mother, absorbing everything with the keen observational skills she had inherited from both parents. For Caleb, Bethlehem was a revelation. He had never been in a town this large, never seen a marketplace with so many goods, never heard so many different accents and dialects. He walked through the streets with wide eyes, taking in the spice merchants with their fragrant displays, the potters shaping clay on their wheels, the metal workers hammering copper into bowls and ornaments, and everywhere, the people, more people than he had ever seen in one place, moving and talking and bargaining and laughing, a vast, chaotic, endlessly fascinating spectacle of human life. Ruth was there too, of course, her family having come to Bethlehem for the same reason. Caleb found her at the marketplace on their second day in town, and they walked together through the stalls, comparing what they saw with what they knew from their own villages. Ruth pointed out a bolt of cloth dyed in a deep purple that she said came from the sea snails of the coast, a dye so expensive that only the very wealthy could afford it. Caleb showed her a carpenter's tool he had never seen before, a type of chisel with a curved blade that could carve decorative patterns in wood. They were two young people on the cusp of adulthood, discovering the world together, and the joy of that discovery was written on their faces as clearly as the inscriptions on the stones of the old city walls. But it was on the third evening in Bethlehem that the journey revealed its true significance, not in any dramatic event but in a quiet moment that contained more meaning than 1,000 loud proclamations. The family was gathered on the rooftop of their host's house, which offered a view over the surrounding hills and the valley beyond. The moon was full that night, huge and luminous, hanging in the sky like a lantern. Its light transformed the landscape, turning the earth silver and the shadows deep blue, and the effect was breathtaking, like seeing the world through entirely different eyes. Ezra sat with his family around him, Miriam beside him, the children close, and he felt a sense of completeness that went beyond mere contentment. He looked at each of them in turn, Caleb with his new maturity and his quiet, growing confidence, Hannah with her bright eyes and her blue ribbon, Asher asleep in Miriam's lap with one thumb in his mouth, and he understood something that he had always known but had never articulated. His family was not just a group of people who shared a house and ate meals together. They were his purpose. They were the reason he woke before dawn and worked until his hands ached. They were the reason he prayed and planned and worried and hoped. Everything he did, every stroke of the adze, every beam he lifted, every prayer he offered, was for them. And in that moment, under the full moon in the city of his ancestors, with the weight of generations pressing against his back and the promise of the future shining in his children's faces, Ezra felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Miriam felt it too. She leaned her head against Ezra's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that she rarely permitted herself in public, and she whispered something that only he could hear. She told him that this journey had been worth every blister, every sleepless night, every moment of worry and exhaustion. She told him that seeing Bethlehem through their children's eyes had renewed something in her, had reminded her that the world was bigger and more beautiful than the daily grind of survival sometimes allowed her to see. And she told him with a simplicity that was all the more powerful for its lack of embellishment, that she was grateful for him, for the life they had built, for the family they had made together out of nothing but love and hard work and faith. They sat together in the moonlight for a long time, not speaking, not needing to speak, connected by the invisible threads of shared experience, shared sacrifice, and shared hope that had been woven through every day of their married life. Below them, the town was quiet, the last fires dying down, the last conversations fading into silence. Above them, the moon moved slowly across the sky, marking the passage of time with the same steady patience it had shown since the beginning of the world. The return journey was notable for its contrasts with the outgoing trip. The family was more experienced now, more efficient in their travel routines, and the road, which had seemed so intimidating on the way out, felt almost familiar on the way back. Caleb walked with a new confidence, his shoulders squared, his stride longer. Hannah chattered constantly about everything she had seen, her voice a running commentary that ranged from the profound to the absurd, with the unpredictable energy of a 9-year-old mind. Asher, who had recovered fully from his fever, was a handful on the return trip, his curiosity fueled by the new experiences and his energy seemingly inexhaustible. But there was a shadow over the return journey, a development that had unfolded in Bethlehem and that now followed the family like a cloud. Simon, Ruth's father, had approached Ezra on the last evening in the city and had raised in the indirect, circuitous manner that such conversations required the possibility of a future match between Caleb and Ruth. The proposal was not unexpected, but its formality caught Ezra off guard. Simon had spoken of the bride price, of the gifts that would be expected, of the wedding feast that would need to be planned. The numbers he mentioned were not outrageous, but they were significant, and Ezra had left the conversation with a heavy feeling in his chest, the weight of a promise he was not sure he could keep. He had not told Miriam about the conversation, not yet. He was not sure how to frame it, how to present the opportunity without also revealing the burden. He knew Miriam would be practical, would want to know the numbers, would want to calculate whether they could afford it. But he also knew she would see the look in Caleb's eyes when he talked about Ruth, and he knew that look would sway her in ways that numbers never could. The matter came to a head on the second night of the return journey, when the family had stopped to camp near a ruined watchtower that stood on a hillside overlooking a wide valley. The other families had moved on, preferring to push a little further before dark, but Asher was tired and cranky, and Miriam had decided that rest was more important than distance. So they were alone, just the 5 of them, and Boaz the donkey, in a landscape that felt vast and empty and ancient. It was Caleb who brought it up. He approached his father after the evening meal and asked in a voice that was trying to be casual but failing badly, whether Simon had said anything about Ruth. Ezra looked at his son, at this boy who was trying so hard to be a man, and he felt the familiar tug of love and worry that every parent knows. He told Caleb the truth, that Simon had raised the possibility, that the terms were fair but challenging, and that it would require the family to make sacrifices. He did not sugarcoat it, because Ezra believed that honesty, even when it was difficult, was the only foundation on which trust could be built. Caleb listened in silence, his face changing as the implications of his father's words sank in. He understood sacrifice. He had grown up in a household where every resource was precious, where every decision was a calculation of cost and benefit. He knew what it meant for his parents to give up something they needed so that he could have something he wanted. And in that moment, on that hillside under the stars, Caleb made a decision that marked his passage from boyhood to the threshold of manhood. He told his father that he did not want the family to suffer for his sake, that if the price was too high, he would accept it without bitterness, and that what mattered most to him was not any one person but the family itself, the unit, the bond, the unbreakable connection that held them all together. Ezra was so moved by his son's words that he could not speak for several moments. He reached out and put his hand on Caleb's shoulder, gripping it firmly, and the pressure of that grip said everything that words could not. They stood like that for a long time, father and son silhouetted against the moonlit sky, connected by a bond that was deeper than blood, a bond forged in shared labor, shared meals, shared stories, and shared love. Miriam, who had been listening from a short distance away, joined them and wrapped her arms around both of them, pulling them into an embrace that included Hannah, who had materialized from somewhere, and Asher, who had woken up and wandered over with the unerring instinct of a small child who senses that something important is happening. The 5 of them stood together on the hillside, a small cluster of humanity in a vast and indifferent landscape, and in that moment, they were complete. They were whole. They were family. The resolution came weeks later, after they had returned to their village and resumed their daily routines. Ezra took on extra work, accepting commissions from neighboring villages that required him to travel and work longer hours. Caleb worked alongside him with a focus and dedication that bordered on ferocity, determined to contribute as much as he could. Miriam wove extra cloth and sold it at the village market, and even Hannah contributed, gathering herbs and wildflowers that could be sold to the women who made perfumes and medicines. Slowly, steadily, the family accumulated what they needed. It took nearly a year of hard work and careful saving, of small sacrifices that added up to something significant. And when the time came, when Simon arrived in the village with Ruth and his family to formalize the agreement, Ezra was ready. The bride price was paid, the contracts were drawn up at the village gate, and the celebration that followed was modest by some standards, but magnificent by others, because it was fueled not by wealth but by love, by the knowledge that this family had earned every moment of joy through honest work and unwavering commitment to each other. The wedding feast was held under the full moon, as was the custom for celebrations of particular significance. The entire village gathered, bringing food, wine, and music. Miriam had woven a special garment for Ruth, a tunic of fine linen with a pattern that incorporated the colors and motifs of both families, a symbolic joining of 2 traditions into one. Hannah sang, her clear voice rising above the crowd and silencing the chatter, and for a moment, everyone present felt the profound beauty of the occasion, the ancient ritual of two families becoming one, of a young man and a young woman stepping into the future together, carrying with them the traditions, the values, and the love of those who had come before. Caleb and Ruth stood together in the moonlight, their faces radiant, their hands clasped, and Ezra watched them with eyes that were bright with tears he would later deny. Beside him, Miriam was smiling, a smile that contained within it all the years of grinding grain, carrying water, tending fires, and raising children, a smile that said, "This is why we do it. This is what it is all for." As the celebration continued into the night, Ezra stepped away from the crowd and climbed to the roof of his house, the place where so many family evenings had been spent, where so many stories had been told, where so many lessons had been taught. He looked out over the village at the houses and workshops, the gardens and fields, the narrow lanes and the stone walls, and beyond them, at the hills and valleys that stretched to the horizon, silver and shadow under the full moon. He thought about his father, who had taught him everything he knew, who had placed these tools in his hands and said, "Build something." He thought about Miriam, the woman who had been given to him and whom he had chosen every day to love. He thought about his children, each one a miracle, each one a gift, each one a story that was only beginning. And he thought about the daily routines, the grinding and the baking, the hammering and the sawing, the carrying of water and the tending of fire, the prayers at dawn and the stories at dusk. These were not the grand events that would be recorded in scrolls or remembered by future generations. These were the small, quiet, unremarkable acts that constituted the substance of a life, the mortar that held the stones together, the threads that formed the fabric, the fire that kept the darkness at bay. This was family life in biblical times, not the wars and miracles that filled the great narratives, but the love and labor that filled the ordinary days, and it was, in its own humble and beautiful way, sacred. He stood on the roof for a long time, watching the moon complete its journey across the sky, listening to the fading sounds of celebration below, and when he finally descended, he found Miriam waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs, her hand extended, her face illuminated by the last of the lamplight. She did not ask where he had been or what he had been thinking. She simply took his hand, and together, as they had done every night for over 20 years, they walked into their house, lay down on their mat, and listened to the sounds of their family breathing. Tomorrow, Miriam would rise before dawn. She would light the fire, grind the grain, and bake the bread. Ezra would wash his face, say his prayers, and walk to his workshop. The children would eat, work, play, and learn. The donkey would bray, the goats would bleat, and the well would offer its water to whoever came with a jar and the strength to draw it up. The sun would rise, cross the sky, and set behind the western hills, and the moon would follow, faithful and constant, marking the passage of another day in the life of a family that was, in every way that mattered, eternal. If you like this story, tap the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who values family, who understands that the most important things in life are not the things we own, but the people we love. Share it because stories like this deserve to be told, and the people in your life deserve to know that you are thinking of them. And now, if you have watched this far, if you stayed with Ezra and Miriam and their children all the way to the end, then you are someone special. You are someone who understands the power of a good story and the importance of the values it carries. If you watched until the end, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are, so I can see the faces of the people who truly love the stories on this channel. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because every week we bring you stories from the ancient world that are not just informative but deeply emotional, stories that will make you think, feel, and see the world differently. If you are not subscribed, you are missing out on content that was made with passion and purpose, just for people like you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And until next time, remember, the daily routines of love, of sacrifice, of showing up every single day for the people who matter most, these are not small things. These are the greatest things. This is what family life was like in biblical times. And in many ways, this is what family life is still like today.